the Chinese government is also providing sustained, robust subsidies to those companies to keep providing the poison on our streets.
Talking about Leninist Marxist, these young generation are not Leninist and Marxists.
Oh, you are number two. You are going to challenge us. You are going to change the world order. You will replace the U.S., so we will crack down on you.
Striking. This was always bad under the Chinese Communist Party, but it's gotten worse under Xi when it should be getting better.
And the lessons are not that China needs to accelerate reforms or become, more pluralistic, more liberal, even economically, but rather to go back to Stalin and Lenin and Mao.
But first of all, let me just comment on a few other things that have been previously mentioned. As you rightly pointed out, to say that this is all China's fault seems like it's a little bit beyond belief.
Today, we're reacting to a fascinating discussion about the current state of US-China relations. On one side, we have economists Dr. Keyu Jin and Dr. David Li. On the other, we have our so-called China experts. But before we begin, if you enjoy this kind of discussions, please subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Okay, let's get to it.
What, in your view, went wrong with the relationship?
Yeah, well, I think that we were a bit arrogant at the end of the Cold War. Remember the events from the 1989 fall of the Berlin Wall to the collapse of the Soviet Union just a couple of years later. That, for us, was the end. It was a peaceful, successful conclusion of the Cold War. What we didn't realize was that Beijing was using that moment to inaugurate a new Cold War. And that Cold War remained quiet for the first 15 years or so, 20 years. Rush Doshi, who's a friend and until recently was President Biden's China director on the National Security Council staff, wrote a very good book called The Long Game, where he went back and read primary source material from that moment, from 89 to 91 and beyond, and found that Beijing came to regard the United States, in the absence of the Soviet menace, because China was also menaced by the Soviet Union. They didn't have very good relations in the latter decades of the Soviet Union. That China came to regard the United States as the primary military, geopolitical, and ideological adversary. And so back then, Deng Xiaoping embarked on what he called a policy of hiding and biding. Let's hide our time, hide our capabilities, bide our time until we've built up enough net power as a nation to actually challenge the United States directly. And if you fast forward then, China at that point had an economy of just a few $100 billion. China was able, through especially its entry into the World Trade Organization, but also through very important reforms to liberalize the economy up to a point. It was able to grow its economy 20-plus fold. David will know the exact figure, but China's now, what, an $18 trillion economy. So you then fast forward to the rise of Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping comes to power in 2012. And Xi Jinping clearly believes that the moment has come where Beijing no longer needs to really hide and bide anymore. And he gives this very important secret speech that got leaked. One of the first speeches he gave as leader in late 2012, where he tells the story of the demise of the Soviet Union. And he's using it as a parable. He's talking about what lessons the Chinese Communist Party needs to derive in order to avoid the fate. And the lessons are not that China needs to accelerate reforms or become, more pluralistic, more liberal, even economically, but rather to go back to Stalin and Lenin and Mao. And the villain of his speech is Gorbachev. He describes Gorbachev as someone who basically blew it. And he even implicitly criticizes Khrushchev as being too soft-line. He says that the cardinal sin had been criticizing the legacy of Lenin and the legacy of Stalin. So that should have been our first clue that we're going to be dealing with a very different kind of leader who was going to turn back the clock on a lot of Deng Xiaoping's successful reforms and start thinking about a global vision that he wants to pursue. And here we are 12 years later talking about the possibility of a great power war and World War III.
This is a remarkably convenient version of history. According to Matt Pottinger, China secretly launched a new Cold War in 1989, patiently waited for decades, joined the World Trade Organization, became deeply integrated into the global economy, and apparently nobody in Washington noticed until Xi Jinping arrived. But also, Matt removes nearly all agency from Washington. Military bases across Asia, surveillance operations near China's coastline, arms sales to Taiwan, trade restrictions, technology bans. None of that apparently shaped Beijing's thinking. And China's economic rise is presented almost like it was a Western charitable donation, rather than the result of Chinese workers, infrastructure, industrial policy, and reforms.
So David, give us a Chinese perspective, because I imagine that your narrative of what went wrong, I mean, clearly something's gone wrong, but your narrative would be different from Matt's. In what ways would it be different?
We need a deeper and very deep understanding of China, the DNA of the civilization, the DNA of the history, and the DNA of behind the political thinking of today's leaders. And Matt, I respect you a lot, but with due respect, I disagree with your analysis. I believe that the reason for the 12 years huge change from Qing America to Cold War is because misunderstanding of China, which created a very aggressive policy of the US, mostly under President Trump. And then that creates reaction within China, and then escalate to today's situation. Now, what is the DNA of China? First of all, communism is not actually what you believe, you understand, in the name of the Chinese Communist Party. I explain in the book, right after the collapse of the former Soviet Union, what were the leaders in China talking about? They were talking about, very seriously, dropping the name communism from the name of the party. Seriously, I have very official archive, okay? Then they decided, we don't drop it, because we respect history. That's the DNA of China. History should be respected. If they argue, we drop the name communism, then many people in China and their parents, their grandparents who sacrificed their life in civil war will revolt against the ruling party. So instead, they kept the name communism, which is now very, very much a worrisome phrase in today's US politics. Communism, right? Very bad name. By the way, if you check the constitution of North Korea is not a communist country. North Korea dropped the name communism and Marxism from its constitution many years ago. Russia, Vladimir Putin can be anti-Lenin as far as you can go. Putin is a huge anti-communist champion. So anyway, so the deep misunderstanding. What is the fundamental thinking of China? The fundamental thinking of today's China is for China to regain international respect, not by challenging the US. I repeat, China is not in a position or is not intending to challenge the US as a superpower, as a country, for good or for bad, having made huge impact in today's world. China wants to regain respect through economic prosperity and through making contributions in climate change or in other areas to the human history. China lost that respect for the past 150 years. You know this better than I do, since the Opium War, right? Since the Opium War. So China became a livestock at least in China, we believe so. We became a livestock of Western civilizations. So finally, through reform and opening up, China gained its respect. And then just when China's economy became 65% as large as the US come back and say, oh, you are number 2. You are going to challenge us. You are going to change the world order. You will replace the US, so we will crack down on you. And these generated the whole dynamism, including the troubles in Taiwan Strait.
David Li just delivered a crucial point, which is the need to understand the DNA of China. He rightly argues that the escalation between the US and China isn't solely due to Chinese ambition, but stems from a profound misunderstanding, beginning with the Trump administration, that created a policy of aggression. This, in turn, provoked a reaction within China. It's a feedback loop we ignore at our peril. His analysis of the Communist Party's name is striking. Li reveals that after the Soviet collapse, Chinese leaders seriously considered dropping the name communism to adapt, but decided not to out of respect for history and the sacrifices of their people. This isn't about ideology. It's about continuity and legitimacy, a perspective that forces us to rethink our assumptions. Most importantly, Li clarifies that China's goal is not to overthrow the US as a superpower. It's to regain respect lost since the Opium Wars, not through confrontation, but through economic prosperity.
Keyu, your book is, I think, very illuminating about the different generations that we see in China. The generation in power that Xi Jinping personifies is the generation shaped by the Cultural Revolution. But if one looks a little further ahead, the next generation doesn't seem to have anything like the same preoccupations. I mean, I don't know how much you worry about this war scenario, and maybe you should tell us if it's something you worry about. And if it's not, is there a reason to imagine that, I don't know, 10 years from now, the mood will be quite different because there'll be a generational change in politics in both countries?
I do want to come back to the new generation in a little bit because they will shape China's future, politically, economically, and impact on the world. So that's an important point. Even if China doesn't change as a country, as a political system, the people change, you have practically a different country. But first of all, let me just comment on a few other things that have been previously mentioned. As you rightly pointed out, to say that this is all China's fault seems like it's a little bit beyond belief. It's important to see, not just apply just one American perspective on everything. It's important to see the other perspective. First of all, China rejects the notion that China and US are in a current Cold War. You're not supposed to say that. You're not supposed to be animostic towards the Americans on Chinese social media. So just taming the nationalism in China. What do the Chinese think about all of this, right? Coming back to some of what David has said. Chinese believe it's competition. Number two, rising up so fast, catching up to number one, economically and technologically speaking. It's not political, it's not ideological, according to the Chinese, because look at Japan. In the 1980s, Japan was an ally, democracy. It swept the country with Japanese electronics, exports of cars, and most importantly, it won the semiconductors race. What did the US do? Same set of policies. Tariff wars, limiting Japanese investment, involuntary export controls, and the Plaza Accord forcing the Japanese to appreciate. There was no ideological differences there. What did the Japanese do? They submitted because US was the big guy and it was the ally. The problem is China's not going to submit. China is going to go as far as it can. It believes it has the right to pedal its way to prosperity, into technological and economic prosperity. That is kind of along the same lines with David's point, but that's the Chinese view. But that said, what has compounded the problem is there has been woefully bad communication between the two and an utter lack of mutual cultural appreciation. So my point is, it's both of them that got to where we are today. Speaking about cultural misguidance, China, did it really need to announce Made in China 2025? China's going to dominate in all strategic emerging sectors? Boof, that was a Sputnik moment that spooked Americans, and on came this onslaught of export controls and all that stuff. But Chinese pronouncing they want to be number one, that is so common. It's President Xi, but it's all the universities I've interviewed with. Every one of them want to be number one in Asia by 2030. It's the Chinese students. I made the mistake of doing the same when I first got to the US. It's a cultural phenomenon. Now, coming back to the US, did the US need to unleash all these demonization of China and these policy and tariff wars and export controls, making the Chinese believe that the sole goal of the US is to hold it down? That's miscommunication problem. There's even little communication between the two in times of urgency, and I think that is dangerous.
Can I pursue one part of that? And that's kind of popular attitudes. It's very hard to gauge those, of course, because there are no opinion polls that we can rely on. And there's clearly nationalism in China. As you say, the regime actually has to rein it in on social media.
Yeah.
But nationalism and being ready to go to war are different things. And what I can't judge, and this is where the analogy with Germany pre-1914 is quite helpful, is how psychologically ready for war the Chinese people are. The German population was mentally ready for war by 1914. That was very clear. But I'm not so sure about China today. How psychologically ready for war are ordinary Chinese people if a crisis over Taiwan suddenly breaks out?
I think you pointed out the right question. What concerns Chinese in their daily lives is not war and national rejuvenation because of Taiwan. It's still, are our kids going to be educated? Are we going to afford the housing, for our kids to get married and stuff like that? But coming back to the issue of Taiwan, and we talked about this 2027, I want to totally agree with David. There's no such timeline. If there's ever going to be a timeline, maybe 2049, because hear me out here. I disagree with the point of view that there has been a radical change towards Taiwan on the part of Xi. Let me tell you why. Pretty much what he has been saying has been pretty much the party guideline since. Okay, Taiwan, inalienable part of China. 1995, 2000 white papers, not rule out military force or other drastic measures in the event of independence or grave turn of events. 1995, 2000 white papers. Reunification is essential for national rejuvenation, goes back to 1997 by Jiang Zemin. Now, the more important issue is if China believes that there is a permanent loss of Taiwan, that there is no route towards unification by peaceful means or whatever means, then that's the problem. So it's condition-driven rather than timeline-driven.
Neil Ferguson leans on a classic but flawed Western trope, comparing China's psychological state to pre-1914 Germany. But Keyu Jin just dismantles that American-centric narrative instantly. Critically, the US view suffers from historical amnesia. Jin points out that the US applied the exact same tariff wars and export controls to Japan in the 1980s, and Japan was a democratic ally. This proves it was never about ideology or communism. It was about America crushing a number two that got too close. The US spooked itself over Made in China 2025, which Jin correctly identifies as a cultural boast common in Chinese universities, and unleashed a wave of demonization that forced China into a defensive crouch. Jin supports the Chinese stance unequivocally. China rejects the Cold War label. It simply refuses to submit like Japan did. It has every right to peddle its way to prosperity. And on Taiwan, she obliterates the war scare timeline. There is no 2027 deadline. Beijing's policy has been consistent since 1995. It's condition-driven, based on independence moves, not a ticking clock. Ordinary Chinese aren't psychologically preparing for war. They're worried about housing and education. Ferguson's German analogy is a misfire. The US needs to stop projecting its own fears and recognize China's consistent defensive position, rather than manufacturing a crisis.
Chinese policy on Taiwan hasn't really changed. There's been continuity. And she might have said, though she didn't, that actually the US has intermittently appeared to shift its policy away from strategic ambiguity towards something more like an unequivocal commitment to Taiwan. How do you see that fundamental issue? Has there been continuity in Chinese policy on this issue? Is there any discontinuity on the US side? What's your take?
It's true that since roughly 1943, when the Chinese Communist Party started claiming Taiwan as a sovereign territory of a future PRC, that this has been a major Chinese Communist Party goal. Gaining control of Taiwan in some way. But one of the many ways in which Xi Jinping is very different from his predecessors is his lack of patience. His predecessors, of course, pushed these and other core Chinese Communist Party policy goals, but the difference was they were patient. They consider this something that could be addressed many years in the future. We're not seeing that patience anymore with Xi Jinping. And let's be clear about 2027. It's the centennial military building goal. No serious US government source is saying that that is a deadline or a timeline for invasion. It's clearly, though, an effort on the part of China's armed forces under Xi Jinping to have a full toolbox of military capabilities ready to engage in any military scenario vis-a-vis Taiwan that Xi Jinping orders them to do. And if you look at what China's actually doing in terms of this meteoric military buildup, you can see this very clearly.
Actually, Xi says one line, oftentimes, again. He says that I do not care whether something some goal is achieved during my tenure, so long as it is achieved. There's a Chinese expression, I want to achieve something, okay? Maybe 1 generation, 2 generations down the road, I do not care whether it is done today. This is, you know what I mean, right? 功不在我. It's a very specific expression in Chinese. It's hard to translate. Okay, a second point I want to quickly add to Matthew, your point. It is the US policy, by US I mean the White House combined with the Capitol Hill, right? Which in Chinese description is slicing the sausage. You know, with a slicing sausage, right? Like Spanish sausage, you cut it, slice. You move again, you push. You push the issue on Taiwan. You know, there are many documents, very, very technical. You brought a huge paper here. Taiwan policies, right? US issued many policies. Each step is inching towards supporting. Taiwan independence, setting more armament. So it is, to be fair, I think the US side is trying to play up the Taiwan issue to irritate China to get into a war.
CSIS did a war game in which the US ran out of precision missiles, one category of precision missiles, within a week because the stocks are so depleted. Do you worry that the US is not ready for prime time and in a scenario of a confrontation would be in a much weaker position than it was, say, in the mid-1990s or even 10 years ago?
Yeah. Well, I speak with senior officers in the Indo-Pacific Command. I think that they are confident that Beijing would not prevail right now in a contest with the United States, a conventional war. That doesn't negate the point that you're making, which is one that Andrew and I have been making in our book, The Boiling Moat, which is that the United States has to actually seriously, quickly reform our defense industrial base because it has atrophied over the course of the first couple decades of this century when we've been fighting counterinsurgencies, right? We didn't have much need. We needed young men and women. We didn't need elaborate stockpiles of anti-ship weapons and things of that nature. This is very much solvable, okay? We actually, even as we've wrestled in this book with some of the most dire scenarios that you started with, with this presentation today, I mean, it's really ugly scenarios that we want to avoid. In spite of that, we came out pretty optimistic that this is a war that can be deterred so long as the United States in particular, but also Japan and Taiwan. I've just come back from meeting with Taiwan's President Li and with some Japanese leaders as well, talking about the book. If we take these steps, which are not so egregiously expensive, we can actually build up the stockpiles to show that we could stay in a prolonged war. It's important that Xi Jinping understands that we can fight not just a short war, but a long one. That's imperative if he's going to be persuaded not to do something as fateful as launching a blockade, which is an act of war, or an invasion.
Notice what happens when Niall Ferguson asks a very straightforward question. Why has Chinese policy on Taiwan remained consistent while the United States has gradually shifted its own position? Andrew Erickson does not really answer it. Instead, he pivots immediately to Xi Jinping's supposed impatience, China's military buildup, and the familiar 2027 talking point, before admitting that 2027 is not actually an invasion deadline. So the question was about changes in policy, but the answer becomes, look at all these Chinese weapons. Then David Li gives the answer Andrew avoided. He points out that Xi has repeatedly said he does not necessarily expect reunification to happen during his own tenure. More importantly, he describes Washington's approach as slicing the sausage, gradually expanding official ties, increasing arms sales, and inching closer towards support for Taiwanese independence. That does not excuse pressure from Beijing, but it does expose the missing half of the conversation. You cannot keep moving the line, one small step at a time, and then act shocked when the other side notices. Apparently, America is simultaneously unprepared, understocked, and completely dominant. Perhaps the best way to prevent war is not constantly rehearsing how to fight a longer one.
But if we want to learn about the Chinese people, we got to understand how the new generation think. Talking about Leninist, Marxist, these young generation are not Leninists and Marxists. They account for 85% of Chinese borrowing. They are huge spenders of luxury goods. They like to travel. They like to enjoy leisure. This is a different China. The China that you were afraid of were the Foxconn workers that were opting for 3 shifts a night just to earn that extra $2. That's not the new youth. The new youth prefers to lie flat in their parents' home and wait for a better job. They're highly educated. It's the cycle of renewal. That China is not the old model. That critique doesn't apply to them anymore. And speaking about one more thing, I think the view that I think is widely held view that Chinese people have no voice, that is also misplaced. Last year, there were 11,000 protests organized on social media over land use rights alone, not to mention the tens of thousands of others on real estate, stock market crisis, etc. To effectuate change is happening in China. You don't like something, 1/3 of the social media criticisms are about the government.
So never the head of the government.
Never the head of, that's the rule. You got the rule.
Highly suppressed. That's the stuff that gets through. Highly suppressed.
You can't actually censor an item overnight. It's already becoming a national taboo. Anyway.
So we could.
I just want to say,
Okay,
I think the generation of Chinese that Keyu is describing should be our natural allies. I have high hopes for the current generation, the new generation in China. I think if they were given the chance to elect their leader, they would not elect a Marxist-Leninist who, on the 200th birthday of Marx, visited Marx's grave in the UK.
They may elect a Chinese Putin.
Well, this is
Seriously.
But that's
seriously.
against the DNA. That's
I have
against
more
the
faith
DNA, you
That
said.
is well, there are people who are.
we could quite easily keep this up for not only half an hour, but half a day, perhaps half a week.
Keyu, my question actually is for you. I think all this talk about Taiwan is overblown. What is the risk to American citizens, American consumers, the American economy of a complete rift with China, whereby we're not able to import the tariffs that are talked about are a tax on the American consumer. It's not what Donald Trump said, that China pays for it. The U.S. consumer pays for it. What happens in that rift? Because you're an expert in international trade flows. Thank you.
Keyu, that's a question to you.
Well, when we say that China has already assumed some kind of normality in terms of this, kind of disengagement, economic disengagement with the U.S., China's primary trading partners in renewables and all EVs is with Europe. So it matters much more what Europe does in terms of policies to China than the rest. But I gave you the example of Tesla, right? And all these American companies in China. Apple, for instance, still making huge profits in China. I think they make really, a very important combination. The Chinese youth still love the NBA. They love Hollywood movies. We need to keep them, keep that going. But I think that banning, sanctioning companies left and right, banning Chinese investment going to the U.S., 22% drop in Chinese students going to the U.S. since 2019, but 85% of Chinese students have returned to China. That's voting with their feet. So keep the knowledge exchange open, keep the collaborative research. And by the way, for every $1 that U.S. spends on renewable investment, China spends $3. It's important to me.
Matt, it's undeniable that there are costs to U.S. consumers of worse relations with China.
Yeah.
What's your answer?
Let me ask, sir, have you considered what the cost is of allowing China to continue stealing American intellectual property or the hollowing out of our manufacturing base? Is that not a tax on the American people? What about fentanyl?
American companies are willingly giving their technology to Chinese in order to have access to the market.
I personally
it's $1
interviewed-
billion for consumers.
Okay.
American companies want that access, and they're not forced to give it over. Microsoft doesn't have to give source code. They make a conscious decision at the CEO board level to do that for access.
When the U.S. Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer opened this investigation into the systematic theft of our IP, as well as policies in China that require you, as the condition of getting market access, again, you could say, well, it's fine, we just give up the Chinese market. But if you want that access, you do have to give over that IP. And that has only intensified over the last few years with China's new laws that require all data in China, all data, to be not only accessed, but controllable by the government. So what about fentanyl, right? I mean, Beijing, Congress just came out with a bipartisan report that said not only is China the main provider of all the chemicals that are being synthesized into the fentanyl, the illegal, not the legal stuff, the illegal fentanyl that's killing 80,000 Americans a year. The Chinese government is also providing sustained, robust subsidies to those companies to keep providing the poison on our streets. Is that not a tax on the American people?
Keyu wanted one last word, and then we're going to go for the next
Matt, the
question.
opposite is actually happening with EVs and renewables. Look at what European companies are doing. They said they want to invest and sign joint venture companies with the Chinese companies to get their technology. And what happens? They're happening everywhere, all around Europe. It's just the cycle. China has a better technology. They're going to work together, access for market. It's just flipped.
Dr. Keyu just brilliantly dismantled the outdated American caricature of China. Matt Pottinger's response is a masterclass in deflection. When confronted with the real cost of tariffs to US consumers, he pivots to IP theft and fentanyl, avoiding the economic accountability Americans actually face. Critically, the American view assumes this generation should be natural allies against their own government. What an arrogant projection. But as Dr. Keyu said, 85% of Chinese youth aren't Leninists. They're luxury consumers who prefer to lie flat and wait for better jobs. They are voting with their feet. 85% of students return home, rejecting the US narrative. Pottinger cries foul over forced tech transfer, yet Jin points out European companies are clamoring to form joint ventures with Chinese EV makers because China has superior technology. The cycle has flipped. While the US spends $1 on renewables, China spends $3. The American tactic of sanctioning everything hasn't crippled China. It's pushed it toward Europe. Pottinger wants a Cold War. Jin shows us the new China is far too busy enjoying leisure and buying luxury goods to fight one.
Keyu, any thoughts on public diplomacy? In a way, you've been a kind of ambassador for China since I've known you. I mean, could we do more? I mean, you began by talking about mutual misunderstanding. Could we do more in the sense that the lady asked about public diplomacy?
Well, first of all, we need to talk more. We need to mingle more, not twice a year, probably twice a month. And I still believe that the channels have to be open for information exchange and flows. Look, you know, the younger generation, thanks to the Western influence and the culture and the movies, they do have a different view of the world. It is very difficult to force down the old ideology on them. And 400,000 of them came to the US every year to study. Don't tell me that has no impact, right? But when you cancel visas, when they're forced to line up borders on the Mexico to come in, that becomes a problem. Many of them are now going to the UK, to Australia. The parents don't feel like they're safe. And the research, science collaborations, medicine collaborations, I mean, renewables, global collaboration, you know, that has to keep going, right?
We need to talk more, not less. Twice a month, not twice a year. Yet the American response has been the exact opposite, cutting off the very exchanges that build understanding. For decades, hundreds of thousands of Chinese students studied in the United States. They encountered American culture, ideas, and institutions firsthand. That is probably one of the most effective forms of influence Washington could ever ask for. And what does America do with that advantage? It restricts visas, treats students like potential spies, and creates an atmosphere where families no longer feel their children are welcome or safe. Then policymakers complain that China is becoming more distant and nationalistic. You cannot build mutual understanding by closing the channels through which understanding actually happens. The irony is that Washington spends billions worrying about Chinese influence while voluntarily dismantling one of its own greatest sources of soft power. Anyway, that's as far as I'll go today. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. If you did, please like and subscribe. I'm genuinely grateful for the support from every single one of you. And let me know in the comments, do you think greater dialogue and cooperation is still possible between these two great powers? And is the United States reducing tensions with China, or helping create the very conflict it claims to fear?